It was great. And we kind of grew together. He did have that music right here and right here.
You won't believe what just happened to Gladys Knight. The 80-year-old music icon, beloved by millions, is facing news so devastating that even her closest friends are struggling to process it. What started as an ordinary day turned into a nightmare that nobody saw coming. The Empress of Soul, who survived decades in the spotlight, now confronts something far more painful than she ever imagined. Fans are flooding social media with tears and prayers. What happened will absolutely break your heart. Gladys Knight sang her first gospel song when she was just 4 years old. Most children that age are still learning to speak in full sentences. But Gladys was already standing in front of a congregation at Mount Moriah Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, delivering performances that left adults speechless. Her voice didn't have that typical childish quality you'd expect. It was deep, rich, and carried an emotional weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. Church members would often say she sang like someone who had already lived through decades of hardship and joy, even though she'd barely started kindergarten. She was born on May 28, 1944, right in the middle of World War II, into a world that was deeply divided by racial segregation. Atlanta was a complicated place to grow up as a Black child during that era. Her father, Merrill Knight, worked as a postal worker, which was actually considered a respectable position for a Black man at the time. It meant steady income and a certain level of security that many families in their community couldn't count on. Her mother, Sarah, contributed to the household finances by working as a nurse's aide. Together, they managed to establish themselves as part of Atlanta's emerging Black middle class, though that didn't shield them from the harsh realities of Jim Crow laws that governed nearly every aspect of daily life. The Knight household was deeply religious, and music was woven into the fabric of their everyday existence. Gladys grew up with 3 siblings, including her brother Merrill Jr., who everyone called Bubba. The family spent considerable time at church, where gospel music wasn't just entertainment but a form of spiritual expression and community bonding. For young Gladys, the church became her first real stage, the place where she learned how to hold an audience's attention and pour genuine emotion into every note she sang. The elders in the congregation recognized almost immediately that this wasn't just a talented child. This was something rare, something special that deserved to be nurtured. Everything changed dramatically in 1952 when Gladys was 8 years old. She appeared on a nationally televised program called Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour, which was one of the most popular talent shows in America at the time. The show gave ordinary people a chance to perform in front of millions of viewers, and winning could genuinely change someone's life. Gladys chose to sing a song called Too Young by Nat King Cole, and her performance left everyone in the studio completely stunned. The judges couldn't believe what they were hearing. The studio audience erupted in applause. Even people watching from their living rooms across the country were calling their neighbors to talk about the little girl with the impossibly mature voice. She won the competition, taking home a grand prize that included $2,000 and a trophy that was almost as tall as she was. For context, $2,000 in 1952 would be worth roughly $20,000 today. So this was genuinely life-changing money for the Knight family. They used part of the winnings to purchase their first television set, which might not sound like a big deal now, but back then, owning a TV was a luxury that most families couldn't afford. Their home quickly became the gathering place for the entire neighborhood. People would come over regularly just to watch programs together, turning the Knight living room into an informal community center. But winning that competition did more than just bring money and a television into their home. It confirmed what her family and church community had been saying all along. Gladys wasn't just good at singing. She was born to do this. The victory gave her confidence and opened doors that might have otherwise remained closed. It also meant that by the age of 8, she was already a recognized performer with national television experience under her belt. That same year brought another pivotal moment, though nobody could have predicted its significance at the time. September 1952 was when Bubba, Gladys's brother, celebrated his 10th birthday. Like most birthday parties, there was music involved. They had a record player set up to keep everyone entertained. But at some point during the celebration, it broke down. The music stopped, and there was that awkward moment of silence that happens when the entertainment suddenly fails. But instead of letting the party fall flat, Gladys started singing. Her brother Bubba joined in, as did their sister Brenda and their cousins Eleanor and William. What started as a spontaneous moment to save a birthday party turned into something much more significant. The performance was so natural, so perfectly harmonized, that their mother immediately recognized what she was witnessing. She told them right then and there that they needed to keep singing together. This wasn't just proud parent talk. Sarah Knight genuinely saw potential in what her children had just created. They decided to form a proper group and needed a name. They chose the Pips as a tribute to their cousin James Woods, whose nickname was Pip. James agreed to become their first manager, even though none of them really knew what that meant at the time. The whole thing was unplanned and organic. There were no auditions, no careful selection process. It just happened, but somehow it felt right from the very beginning. At the time this group formed, the members were incredibly young. Gladys was only 8. The oldest member was 12. They were children playing at being professional performers, except their talent was very real. They started performing at local events and church gatherings, slowly building a reputation in their Atlanta neighborhood. Then in 1953, they got paid for a performance for the very first time. It was at a community center in Atlanta, and they earned $10 for a 15-minute set of gospel and rhythm and blues songs. $10 split among several kids wasn't much, but it represented something crucial. They were no longer just talented children singing for fun. They were professional performers who got paid for their work. From that modest beginning, opportunities began to multiply. By 1955, when Gladys was 11 years old, the Pips had entered the competitive world of talent show circuits. These were regular competitions held throughout the South where performers would compete for prizes and recognition. The Pips entered every single one they could find, and remarkably, they won every single time. They had a perfect record. This wasn't just luck or hometown favoritism. They were genuinely better than their competition, and people in the music industry started taking notice. They weren't being dismissed as cute kids anymore. They were being recognized as serious artists with real potential. By the time Gladys turned 11 in 1955, the Pips had graduated to touring the Chitlin circuit. This was a network of performance venues throughout the South and beyond, where Black performers could work safely during the segregation era. The name came from chitlins, a traditional soul food dish, and the circuit represented one of the few ways Black artists could make a living performing for Black audiences in venues that would actually accept them. But calling it safe is relative. The conditions were often brutal. Sometimes they got paid in food instead of cash. There were nights when they went to bed hungry. They frequently slept in cars or on tour buses because hotels would refuse to rent them rooms. Despite these hardships, they kept performing. They played at legendary venues like the Royal Peacock in Atlanta, and eventually made it to the Apollo Theater in Harlem, which was considered the pinnacle of Black entertainment venues. On these stages, young Gladys got to meet and watch some of the biggest names in Black music. She saw Jackie Wilson perform and was mesmerized by how he commanded a stage. She watched Sam Cooke and learned from his smooth delivery and emotional authenticity. These weren't just entertaining shows for her. They were masterclasses in performance, and she absorbed every lesson she could. Jackie Wilson was particularly impressed by the Pips. By 1957, he used his industry connections to introduce them to Brunswick Records. This led to the Pips recording their very first single when Gladys was just 13 years old. The song was called Whistle My Love, and while it didn't become a national hit, it got significant airplay on local radio stations throughout Georgia. For a group of teenagers, this was an incredible achievement. They were learning how recording studios worked, how to sing into professional microphones, and how to work together as a unit under the pressure of making a commercial record. Brunswick Records eventually dropped them in 1959, but the experience had been invaluable. Then came a setback that felt devastating at the time. In 1959, 2 core members of the group left. Gladys's sister Brenda and their cousin Eleanor departed for family reasons, and it seemed like everything they'd built together might collapse. The remaining members had to make a choice. They could either give up or find a way to continue. They chose to continue. Their cousin Edward Patton joined the group, along with a singer named Langston George. This new lineup actually brought fresh energy and created even stronger harmonies than before. More importantly, it gave the group stability at a crucial moment in their development. Everything came together in 1961 with a song called Every Beat of My Heart. The song became a massive hit, reaching #1 on the rhythm and blues charts and climbing to #6 on the pop charts. But the success came with complications. The original version was sold to VJ Records, and it became hugely popular. However, Fury Records, run by a man named Bobby Robinson, made them record the exact same song again for his label. This created the bizarre situation where two identical versions of the same song by the same group were competing against each other on the chart simultaneously. Behind the scenes, there were legal battles, and the group wasn't being paid fairly for their success. But despite the business problems, they had finally achieved what they'd been working toward for nearly a decade. The world now knew who Gladys Knight and the Pips were. The early 1960s brought success for Gladys Knight and the Pips, but it also exposed them to the brutal realities of touring as Black performers in a segregated America. Even as their songs climbed the charts and their shows drew increasingly large crowds, they couldn't escape the color line that divided nearly every public space in the country. There were days when they had to perform 5 separate shows, moving from venue to venue with barely any time to rest between performances. After giving everything they had on stage, they'd find that most hotels simply refused to book them rooms. Restaurants would turn them away at the door. The cruelty of it was especially sharp when they performed for mixed audiences. White fans would line up to buy tickets, scream their appreciation during shows, and then go eat dinner or sleep in hotels that wouldn't serve the very people who had just entertained them. Inside the theaters themselves, segregation was often physically visible. Rope barriers would divide the seating areas, with Black audience members confined to certain sections and white patrons in others. For Gladys and the group, these experiences didn't break their spirit, but they left deep impressions. She made mental notes about which record labels and venues treated Black artists with basic dignity, and which ones didn't. Years later, when she had more power to choose who she worked with, these memories would influence her decisions. She walked away from contracts and opportunities that others might have accepted, specifically because she remembered how it felt to be treated as less than human, despite her talent and success. In 1962, the Pips released another significant hit called Letter Full of Tears. The song reached #3 on the rhythm and blues charts and crossed over to the pop charts as well, which was always a marker of broader success. This was the first time they'd worked with a full string section, giving their sound a richer, more sophisticated quality. But despite the chart success and the critical recognition, the money wasn't following. Their contracts were structured in ways that heavily favored the record label and management. After everyone else took their cut, there often wasn't much left for the performers themselves. The situation got so bad that Gladys had to take a job as a secretary just to pay her bills. Here was a woman with hit songs on the radio, working a day job because the music industry's financial structure made it nearly impossible for Black artists to earn a fair living from their own work. That same year brought a major personal change. Gladys married James Newman, a musician from Atlanta, and gave birth to their son, James III. She made the difficult decision to step away from the Pips temporarily to focus on being a mother, in an era when women were often forced to choose between career and family. And when her music career was genuinely taking off, she chose to prioritize her newborn child. It was a quiet but powerful decision that showed where her values lay, even when it meant potentially sacrificing professional momentum. She returned to the group in 1964, and they signed with Max Records. This marked the beginning of a significant shift in their sound. Their song Giving Up showcased a different side of Gladys's voice. It had matured considerably. The tone was deeper and more emotionally complex, drawing inspiration from the gospel-infused power that Aretha Franklin was bringing to soul music. The group worked with producer Van McCoy to push their sound in a more soulful direction, moving away from the pop-oriented production they'd been doing. 7 songs from that album were released as singles. One track, Lovers Always Forgive, even received a special mention in Billboard magazine, which was the industry's most important trade publication. These songs didn't become massive commercial hits, but they accomplished something perhaps more important. They caught the attention of Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown Records, which was rapidly becoming the most successful Black-owned record label in America. In late 1965, Gordy offered Gladys Knight and the Pips a contract with Motown. Most artists would have jumped at the opportunity without hesitation, but Gladys had reservations. She worried that Motown would treat them as background players while pouring all their resources and attention into established stars like Diana Ross and the Supremes. She was outvoted by the other members of the Pips, who were eager to join Motown, so she reluctantly agreed. In 1966, they officially joined Motown, but they weren't placed on the main label. Instead, they were assigned to a subsidiary called Soul Records, which focused on deeper, grittier rhythm and blues rather than the polished pop sound Motown was famous for. Their first single for the label, Just Walk in My Shoes, became a surprise hit in the United Kingdom, but the group was furious when they discovered that Motown had secretly replaced their carefully crafted harmonies with studio singers. This felt like a betrayal and an insult to their artistry. They made it absolutely clear to the label that they wanted full control over their vocal sound moving forward, and to their credit, Motown backed down on this issue. Even though Motown organized huge touring events featuring their entire roster of artists, Gladys Knight and the Pips were rarely included in these lineups. The only time they participated was during a special Christmas show at Detroit's Fox Theater. This exclusion reinforced Gladys's initial concerns that they'd be treated as second-tier artists at the label. But everything changed in September 1967 when they released I Heard It Through the Grapevine. The song was an absolute phenomenon. It stayed at #1 on the rhythm and blues charts for 6 consecutive weeks and climbed to #2 on the pop charts. At the time of its release, it became the best-selling single in Motown's history, which was an extraordinary achievement given the label's impressive catalog. The story behind the song became controversial. Marvin Gaye recorded his own version of Grapevine in 1968, which also became a massive hit. Both versions are now considered classics, and both were eventually inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, with the Pips' version receiving that honor in 2018. But Gladys always believed that the original instrumental track had been created specifically for her group, and that Gaye essentially took it. He denied this claim, but the sting of that perceived slight stayed with her for years. It fed into her broader feeling that Motown didn't fully respect or prioritize Gladys Knight and the Pips the way they did their bigger stars. In 1968, the group was given what should have been a tremendous opportunity. They were asked to open for the Supremes on a major tour, but the tour turned into a disaster from a political standpoint. Night after night, Gladys Knight and the Pips would take the stage first and deliver such powerful, energetic performances that audiences would be on their feet, completely energized. This made it incredibly difficult for the Supremes to follow them and match that level of excitement. Diana Ross complained to Motown management, arguing that the opening act was overshadowing the headliners. Rather than recognizing this as proof of Gladys Knight's talent, Motown cut her group from the tour entirely. This happened right after their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 25, 1968, which was one of the most watched programs on television. They performed Grapevine and another song called The End of Our Road, which became a significant hit, reaching number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100. The End of Our Road showcased yet another evolution in their sound. Working with producer Norman Whitfield, they started incorporating psychedelic elements into their soul foundation. It was experimental and strange, blending the introspective, effects-heavy sound that bands like the Beatles were exploring with the raw, emotional power of soul music. Motown was trying to prove they could compete with what was happening in rock music, and this song succeeded in that goal. Their Ed Sullivan appearance gave the song crucial exposure and proved that Gladys Knight and the Pips could win over mainstream pop audiences without abandoning their soul roots. In 1969, they released Friendship Train, which transcended being just another hit song. It carried an explicit message about unity and coming together during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The country was being torn apart by debates over the Vietnam War, and the civil rights movement was entering a new, more militant phase, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. the previous year. Friendship Train reached number 2 on the rhythm and blues charts and number 17 on the pop charts. They performed it on The Ed Sullivan Show just 2 weeks after its release, when it was still climbing the charts. The audience response was enthusiastic, and the song became their first Grammy-nominated track. It demonstrated that they weren't afraid to address real social issues through their music, even when that might have been commercially risky. At the end of 1970, a song called "If I Were Your Woman" almost never made it to Gladys Knight. 2 other artists had already turned it down before producer Norman Whitfield fought to get it recorded by the Pips. Released in late 1970, it shot to number 1 on the rhythm and blues charts in January 1971 and reached number 9 on the pop charts. The album performed strongly as well, hitting number 35 on the main album chart and number 4 on the rhythm and blues album chart. What had started as a song nobody seemed to want became one of Motown's greatest successes, proving once again that Gladys had an instinct for material that other people couldn't always recognize. Their biggest Motown song arrived in December 1972. "Neither One of Us Wants to Be the First to Say Goodbye" was saturated with heartbreak and emotional truth. It hit number 1 on the rhythm and blues chart, climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, and eventually won them a Grammy in 1974. But by the time they received that Grammy, they had already left Motown. The relationship had been deteriorating for years. Gladys later said publicly that they were always given whatever songs the bigger stars didn't want. While artists like Marvin Gaye or the Supremes got first pick of the best material, Gladys Knight and the Pips got the leftovers. Even as Neither One of Us was climbing the charts and becoming one of the year's biggest songs, they made the decision to walk away in 1973. They left right at the peak of their Motown success, which shocked the industry but made perfect sense to anyone who understood how frustrated they'd become with their treatment at the label. Leaving Motown in 1973 was an enormous risk. Gladys Knight and the Pips were walking away from the most successful Black-owned record label in America, leaving behind a string of hits and the security that came with being part of the Motown machine. They signed with Buddha Records, a label that was primarily known for bubblegum pop acts and didn't have any real reputation in the soul music world. Many people in the industry thought they'd made a terrible mistake, but the gamble paid off almost immediately. Their first album with Buddha, called Imagination, was released in 1973 and went gold within just a few months. Gold certification meant it had sold more than 500,000 copies, which was a significant commercial achievement. More importantly, Buddha gave them something Motown never had: creative control and the freedom to shape their own sound. Then came the song that would define Gladys Knight's entire career. The track started its life as something completely different, a song called "Midnight Plane to Houston" that had been recorded by another artist named Cissy Houston. When it came to Gladys and her team, someone suggested changing the destination from Houston to Georgia, and that small modification made all the difference. "Midnight Train to Georgia" was released in August 1973, and at first, it didn't make much of an impression. Radio stations played it occasionally, but it wasn't getting the kind of attention that creates a hit. Then gradually, something shifted. Word of mouth started building. More stations added it to their playlists. Within 8 weeks of its release, the song jumped to number 1 on the charts on October 27, 1973, knocking the Rolling Stones out of the top position. It stayed at number 1 for 2 weeks and sold over 1 million copies. On October 18, 1973, it was officially certified gold. The song won a Grammy in 1974 for Best R&B Vocal Performance by a Duo, Group, or Chorus, and in 1999, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, which recognizes recordings of lasting qualitative or historical significance. What made Midnight Train to Georgia so special wasn't just Gladys's lead vocal, though that was certainly powerful. It was the call and response interaction between her and the other members of the group, particularly her brother Bubba. While she sang the main story, They provided commentary and emotional support in the background, creating a conversation that made the whole performance feel intimate and real. The song told a story that resonated with millions of people, choosing love and home over ambition and bright lights. It became one of those rare songs that transcends its era and remains recognizable decades later. Late in 1973, they released another major hit called "I've Gotta Use My Imagination." This song was completely different from "Midnight Train to Georgia." It was bold, funky, and full of confident energy. Released as a single, it climbed to #1 on the Soul chart in early 1974 and reached #4 on the pop chart. It sold more than 1 million copies and represented yet another evolution in their sound. Producer Tony Camillo crafted a track with deep bass lines, infectious rhythm, and a modern feel that moved beyond traditional soul into something more contemporary. Gladys's vocals on this track showed a new kind of confidence. She wasn't just singing about heartbreak or nostalgia. She was claiming her own power and agency, and audiences responded enthusiastically. By 1974, Gladys Knight and the Pips had become genuinely international stars. They embarked on tours of Europe and Japan that year, and the response was overwhelming. In Japan particularly, fans would camp outside venues for days, just hoping to catch a glimpse of the performers. Back in the United States, their song "Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me" was dominating the rhythm and blues charts. That tour reportedly brought in over $2 million, which was an enormous sum for the time. It proved definitively that they weren't just successful in America, they had become global legends. Some of their performances during these tours were so powerful that they were later released as live albums, preserving those moments for fans who couldn't attend in person. In October 1974, they released "I Feel a Song, In My Heart." The track topped the Soul chart for 2 consecutive weeks and reached #21 on the Billboard Hot 100. Tony Camillo, the same producer who had worked on "Midnight Train to Georgia," created a lush arrangement featuring rich string sections and deep, complex rhythms. The song had originally been recorded by someone else in 1971, but Camillo and Gladys completely transformed it. What had been a fairly straightforward pop song became something elegant and almost cinematic in their hands. It demonstrated that soul music didn't have to be raw and rough to be authentic. It could be sophisticated and carefully arranged while still maintaining emotional truth and power. The success continued through the mid-1970s, but by 1978, the music industry landscape was changing dramatically. Disco had taken over radio and dance floors, and the kind of soul music that Gladys Knight and the Pips specialized in was falling out of fashion. Their final album with Buddha Records, called "The One and Only," was released in August 1978, and it was clear that something had shifted. The album barely cracked the top 150 on the main album chart. 4 singles were released from it, and not one of them made it onto the Billboard Hot 100. The only real success came in the United Kingdom, where one song reached #15. The writing was on the wall. The disco era had fundamentally changed what audiences wanted to hear, and their traditional soul sound didn't fit the moment. At the same time this was happening, Gladys quietly released her first solo album, called Miss Gladys Knight. It was an experiment, a way of testing whether she could succeed outside the group structure that had defined her entire career. The album reached #57 on the Rhythm and Blues chart, which was respectable but not spectacular. She was essentially asking herself what came next, trying to figure out if there was a path forward as a solo artist, or if the group dynamic was essential to her success. The answer wasn't immediately clear, and she continued working with the Pips while keeping the solo option open. In 1980, the group made one final attempt at recapturing their earlier success. They signed with Columbia Records, one of the biggest labels in the industry, and released an album called About Love on February 1st. The album reunited them with the songwriting and production team of Ashford and Simpson, who had been responsible for some of their earlier hits. The collaboration produced 3 songs that made it onto the charts, proving that they still had the ability to create commercially viable music. But even as they found some level of success again, the internal dynamics of the group were quietly falling apart. Gladys was becoming increasingly interested in solo work, and was getting offers to collaborate with other major artists. One of these collaborations became one of the biggest hits of the entire 1980s. Gladys sang on That's What Friends Are For, a charity single that also featured Dionne Warwick, Elton John, and Stevie Wonder. The song was released to raise money for AIDS research at a time when the epidemic was devastating communities and the disease was still poorly understood. It became a massive hit, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and winning multiple Grammy Awards. For Gladys, it demonstrated that she could hold her own alongside some of the biggest names in music, and that her voice remained powerful and relevant, even as musical trends continued to evolve. The Pips released their final album together, called All Our Love, in 1987. The album went gold, proving they could still sell records, but everyone involved knew this was the end. They had one final hit called Love Overboard, released in November 1987. The song showed remarkable versatility, hitting #1 on the Rhythm and Blues chart, #13 on the Billboard Hot 100, and #4 on the dance chart. It won them a Grammy in 1988, which was a fitting way to close out their career together. They embarked on one final tour, playing for audiences who had followed them for decades, and then said goodbye for good. Just before the group officially disbanded, in May 1989, Gladys recorded License to Kill, which served as the theme song for the James Bond film of the same name. The song featured a dramatic orchestral arrangement that perfectly suited the Bond franchise's cinematic style, and Gladys's powerful voice brought genuine emotion to what could have been just another action movie theme. Interestingly, while the song never charted in the United States, it became absolutely huge in Europe. It spent 8 weeks at #1 in Sweden and peaked at #6 in the United Kingdom. Music critics and Bond fans have frequently cited it as one of the best theme songs in the entire franchise, even though American audiences largely overlooked it. The song proved that Gladys Knight's voice could adapt to different contexts and that her appeal extended far beyond the rhythm and blues market where she'd built her career. Behind all the success and hit records, Gladys Knight's personal life was marked by heartbreak and struggle. She was only 16 in 1960 when she married James Newman, a local musician from Atlanta. She had just discovered she was pregnant, but tragically, the baby didn't survive. Eventually, she and James had 2 children together, Jimmy in 1962 and Kenya in 1963. But James became addicted to drugs, and by the time Gladys was 20, he was essentially gone. In her 1997 memoir, she still called him the love of her life, despite the pain his addiction caused. They divorced in 1973, and James died a few years later. Just 1 year after her divorce, Gladys married Barry Hankerson, a music producer. Their son Shanga was born in 1976, but the marriage was turbulent. By 1979, it ended, and what followed was every parent's nightmare. During their custody battle, 3-year-old Shanga was kidnapped. Gladys spent over $1 million trying to get him back, and the trauma devastated her career and mental health. The aftermath left Gladys battling depression, and she found escape in gambling. In the late 1980s, she became addicted to baccarat and blackjack. The losses were staggering. One night alone, she lost $660,000. She would sit at tables for hours, sometimes forgetting to pick up her son from school, routinely losing $20,000 to $40,000 in just hours. The breaking point came when she won $60,000, then lost it all minutes later. Sick with despair, she called Gamblers Anonymous from inside the casino. Someone came immediately and took her to a meeting. That call saved her life, and she never gambled again. In 1995, she married motivational speaker Les Brown, hoping for stability. But he mismanaged their finances badly, and by 1997, they were divorced, leaving her with serious tax problems, reportedly exceeding $100,000. Then came William McDowell, whom she married in 2001. He was 33 years younger, but the relationship lasted over 20 years. However, in August 2025, her son Shanga accused William of mentally and financially abusing his mother. Filing a report with North Carolina authorities, Gladys fired back, insisting she was healthy, happy, and misrepresented. In 1997, following her son Jimmy's conversion, Gladys joined the Mormon Church and formed a gospel choir called Saints Unified Voices, which won a Grammy in 2006. Tragically, Jimmy died in 1999 at just 37. In 2015, William Guest, her cousin and original Pips member, died at 74. In 2018, she was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer, but caught it early and recovered successfully. In 2021, Shanga was sentenced to 2 years in prison for failing to pay over $1 million in restaurant taxes. That same year, President Biden awarded Gladys the National Medal of Arts. In 2022, she received Kennedy Center honors. In March 2025, she fell ill with flu and was briefly hospitalized. Then in September 2025, a cruel Facebook hoax claimed she had died, fooling nearly 1 million people before her team confirmed she was alive and well.